Scott's voice echoed in Julia's head like a ghost refusing to fade. It had been nearly 2 years since he left. Not a breakup, not a fight. He just left. A packed bag, a short message on the kitchen counter, and silence ever since. No goodbye, no closure. Julia remembered standing in their shared apartment, shaking, trying to make sense of the 7 years that disappeared, like smoke in her hands. She had begged for answers back then, left voicemails that slowly turned from panic to tears to nothing at all. But she didn't die. She didn't shatter the way she thought she would. At first, every day felt like carrying a mountain. Her mornings were soaked in memories of Scott's cologne and the sound of his laugh echoing through the hallway. Her evenings were worse. Dinner for one, wine with no conversation, and a bed that felt like a grave. But pain, she realized, was like fire. It burned through. But once it was done, new skin could grow, tougher, smarter. It was around that time Julia met John. He was different, calm, stable, gentle in ways Scott had never been. He didn't rush her into anything, didn't ask too many questions about her past. He just stayed. And that small act, staying, meant the world to a woman who had been abandoned. Julia didn't fall for John all at once. It wasn't wild. It wasn't fireworks. It was slower, softer, like a sunrise instead of a lightning bolt. He'd sit with her in silence, let her cry if she needed, and laugh with her when she remembered how. She learned to breathe again. She started painting, started living. Slowly she stopped comparing every touch to Scott's, every word to what used to be. The wound didn't disappear, but it scarred over, and that was enough. And then, last Thursday evening, everything unraveled again. She was locking up her art studio, now her full-time job, when she turned around and there he was. Scott, same. Green eyes, same jawline she used to trace with her fingers in bed, but older, tired. His voice broke the night open with a single word, Julia. She froze. Everything inside her clenched at once, like her heart forgot how to beat and her lungs forgot what air was. She didn't speak, just stared. He looked at her like a man who had traveled through hell just to find home again. I know I don't deserve this, he began, but please, can we talk? Julia hated that part of her wanted to listen, hated the way her knees weakened, the way her chest tightened with old feelings she thought she'd buried deep enough. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words refused to come. You don't owe me anything, Scott said, softer now. But I never stopped thinking about you. I made a mistake, and I regret it every day. I thought I needed space, but all I did was lose the one person who ever made me feel alive. Julia looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't prepared to feel anything for him ever again. I'm with someone, she said, the words sharp like a blade. Someone who didn't disappear when things got hard. Scott's eyes flickered. John, right? Of course, he knew. Small town. People talk. I'm not here to ruin anything. He added quickly. I just needed to say it. That I was wrong. That I still love you. The silence after that sentence hung in the air like a noose. Julia swallowed. Her heart was loud. Her thoughts louder. What was she supposed to do with this? She looked at him, at the man who broke her, and realized something terrifying. She still loved him, but she loved John too. And for the first time in her life, she was about to find out what it meant to truly choose. Julia didn't sleep that night. She lay next to John, his arm resting gently around her waist, like it always did, his breathing steady and warm against the back of her neck. Safe. That's what John was. He was safety wrapped in kindness. But Her mind kept drifting to the look in Scott's eyes. Regret, hunger. A pain she once knew so well in herself, mirrored perfectly in him now. She slipped out of bed just after 4 a.m. and walked barefoot to the kitchen, the cold tiles grounding her as if her thoughts might float her into madness. She poured a glass of water, not because she was thirsty, but because her hands needed something to do besides tremble. She stared out the window, watching the early morning fog twist around the streetlights, like ghosts returning to old homes. Scott was back, and the part she hated most was how fast the past rushed to the surface the moment she saw him. The way his voice still made something in her chest ache. How much of her had stayed broken, even when she told herself she was healed. Couldn't sleep. John's voice broke softly into the silence. Julia turned, startled. "Yeah," she said, trying to sound normal. "Just thoughts." He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Anything you want to talk about?" She hesitated. It would be easy to lie, to brush it off, but that wasn't the kind of relationship they had. John had never given her a reason to doubt him, and she wasn't going to start hiding things. "Now, Scott's back," she whispered. She felt John tense, just slightly, then loosen again. His voice stayed calm. "You saw him. Yesterday. Outside the studio. He said he still loves me." John was silent for a long moment. Then, "And what did you say?" "I told him I'm with someone. That I've moved on. But you're still thinking about him," John said quietly. She turned to face him, her eyes full of guilt and confusion. "I don't want to lie to you, John. I'm thinking about everything. What we had. How it ended. How much it still hurts sometimes. I didn't expect him to come back. I didn't expect to feel anything." John nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Then he said, "You loved him for a long time. It makes sense that seeing him again would shake you. I get that." Julia blinked, surprised by his understanding. "But," he continued, "I also know what we have, and I believe in it. I believe in you. If you need space to sort out your feelings, I won't stop you. But if you still want me, if we still matter, then I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Not because she was sad, but because John was everything Scott never had the patience to be. She hugged him, held on tight, and didn't speak. Just let herself feel what it meant to be loved without chaos. That day at work was a blur. Her hands moved on autopilot, painting strokes she didn't remember making. She kept looking at her phone, half expecting another message from Scott. But there was nothing, no follow-up, no pressure. It made her feel something she couldn't quite name. Wanda dropped by around noon, her energy like a gust of wind, loud and chaotic in the best way. "Girl, you look like you've been hit by a damn truck. What's going on?" Julia hesitated, then spilled everything. Scott. The surprise. The confession. John's reaction. Wanda leaned back in the studio chair, arms crossed. "Okay, first of all, your man John. A saint. I would have set Scott's car on fire if it were me. Second, are you seriously thinking about that bastard again?" Julia looked down, ashamed. "I don't know. I loved him, and it never really went away. But I love John too. It's different, but real." Wanda stared at her. "Okay, real talk. Scott shattered you. You stitched yourself back together and built something beautiful. Now he comes back and says a few sweet words and you're drowning in the past." That man walked away without a word, Julia. No explanation, just vanished. "I know," Julia whispered. Wanda softened a little. "You don't have to punish yourself for feeling something. But just remember who stayed when you couldn't even find yourself." Julia nodded slowly. Wanda always knew how to cut through. The fog. Later that evening, when Julia closed up the studio, she found a letter taped to the front door. It was from Scott. Her fingers trembled as she peeled the envelope from the door. There was no name on the outside, just her first initial, J. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, messy, with too much pressure on the loops. Scott always wrote like he was, in a hurry to get the words out before they disappeared. Julia didn't open it right away. She stood there in the soft evening light, her heart pounding in her ears. The quiet street around her buzzed with the low hum of distant traffic. But inside her, it was chaos. She got in the car and drove home without turning on the radio. The silence wrapped around her like a question she couldn't answer. Once inside, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter like it might burn her fingers. The house was empty. John had left her a text saying he'd gone to visit his brother for the night. Gave her space, just like he promised. She slid her nail under the seal and unfolded the paper. "Julia, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything, really. But I needed you to hear the things I was too much of a coward to say back then. I left because I was drowning, not because of you, but because of me. You loved me better than I deserved. And every day I lived with the fear that one day you'd see through me, that you'd realize I wasn't enough for you, so I ran, like I always do. It wasn't about needing space. It was about fear, and I hate myself for that, for how I hurt you, for how I let you suffer in silence, when I should have been by your side. You've probably moved on. Maybe you're in love again. I saw it in your eyes. You're not broken anymore. And God, Julia, you're even more beautiful when you've healed. If this is the last time you ever hear from me, then I just want you to know, I never stopped loving you. I thought walking away would set you free. But the truth is, I broke the both of us. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But I needed to tell you. Losing you was the worst mistake of my life. Scott." She read it twice. Then a third time, the words were raw, not perfect, not polished, but painfully real. Scott had never been good at talking about his feelings. Not like this. He used to deflect, joke, disappear. This letter felt like a version of him she'd never met before. She sat there for a long time, the letter limp in her hands, heart spinning in 1,000 directions. She felt grief all over again. Grief for the man he had been, for the love they had shared, for the girl she used to be when she believed forever actually meant something. But there was also something else, a quiet, guilty part of her that wondered, what if he really has changed? What if all the years apart carved something better into him? Her phone buzzed. It was John. "I hope you're okay. I love you. No pressure, no expectations. Just that." Julia closed her eyes. Her heart pulled in two directions, one rooted in stability and kindness, the other in fire and history. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with painful clarity. Whatever choice she made, someone would get hurt, maybe even her. And there was no going back to the person she was before Scott showed up at her door. Later, that night, unable to sleep again, Julia walked out into the quiet night air and stood beneath the stars. She held the letter in her hand, staring at it for a moment before folding it back up. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't run to him either. Not yet. There was still one thing she needed before she made any decision. To see Scott again, not to relive the past, but to look him in the eye and ask the one question that haunted her every day since he left. Why wasn't I enough for you to stay? The next morning, Julia dressed slower than usual. Her hands lingered too long over clothes that didn't matter. It wasn't about what she wore. It was about what she felt. Or didn't want to feel. She tied her hair back, let her face stay bare. If she was going to face Scott again, she wanted to do it as herself. No mask, no softening. She didn't tell John she was going to see him. She wasn't ready for that conversation, not until she had some answers. Or at least some peace. Scott agreed to meet at a quiet cafe just outside town. Neutral ground, public, less risk of emotional outbursts. Julia sat near the window, fingers wrapped around a coffee she hadn't touched. She watched him walk in like it was a scene from someone else's life. Same old Scott, but not really. He looked older, not just in his face, but in his posture, like life had weighed him down and he'd finally stopped trying to pretend it didn't hurt. He saw her and stopped for a second. His face twisted. Relief, fear, regret, all of it. Then he walked over and sat down slowly. "Hey," he said. She nodded. "Hey!" There was a heavy silence. Not awkward, just thick with too much unsaid. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, voice low. "I needed to ask you something," she said, cutting through the polite pretense. Scott nodded. "Okay." She looked him straight in the eyes. No trembling, just truth. "Why wasn't I enough for you to stay?" He flinched just a little, then leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands twisted together like he was holding on to something invisible. "You were," he said. "God, Julia, you were more than enough. That was the problem." She stared at him, unblinking. "That doesn't make sense." "It does if you knew how broken I was back then," he said. "You loved me like I was whole, and I knew I wasn't. I felt like I was always pretending, always waiting for you to see through it. And the truth is, I didn't think I deserved you. You still don't," she said quietly. No cruelty, just honesty. He winced, but nodded. "Probably true. I hated myself for leaving. But I also thought I was giving you a chance to find better. I thought I was doing the right thing." Julia shook her head. "You don't get to disappear and call it a noble act. You left me to bleed alone." Scott looked like he might break right there. I know I did. And I'll never stop being sorry for it." She looked out the window, watching the wind stir the trees. "I'm with someone now," she said. "Someone who stayed, who helped me pick up the pieces you left behind. I'm not here to steal you back," Scott said quickly. "I came back because I couldn't carry the guilt anymore, because I wanted to own what I did. And if you hate me forever, I'll understand." She finally looked back at him. "I don't hate you. I just don't trust you, and I don't know if I ever could again." He nodded. "That's fair." There was a pause. Then Julia said, "When you left, you took more than just yourself. You took the version of me that believed love was enough to make someone stay." Scott looked gutted. "I'm not that girl anymore," she continued. "I loved you. I probably still do in some small broken way. But I'm not looking for chaos anymore." He blinked hard. His jaw clenched. "I just needed to hear you say it," Julia said. "Not for closure. Just so I could stop pretending I didn't want answers." Scott nodded slowly. "I wish I could go back. Do it right." "You can't," she said. "But you can leave now, and let me keep what I've built without you." Scott stood up. He didn't argue, didn't plead, just said, "I'm sorry," one more time before walking out the door. Julia sat there for a while. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. Instead, she texted John, "I'm coming home." John was sitting on the porch when she pulled into the driveway. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long, quiet shadows over the grass. He stood up when he saw her, but didn't move any closer. He waited, just like he always did, letting her come to him. Julia stepped out of the car and met his eyes. I saw him. she said. John nodded. I figured. She walked slowly toward him, her heart beating harder now than it had back at the cafe. This was the moment that mattered. Not seeing Scott, not reliving old wounds. It was what she said now, what she chose now. John stepped aside and opened the front door like he didn't want to pressure her to come in. But she slipped past him without hesitation and sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap. I asked him why. He left, she said quietly. John leaned on the doorframe, watching her. What did he say? That he thought he wasn't enough, that I was too good, that he ran before I could figure out how broken he was. John gave a short laugh, more bitter than amused. Sounds familiar. Julia looked up. What do you mean? I mean, that's what guys like him always say. I left because you were too good. They don't leave because of you, Julia. They leave because they're too scared to be seen for what they really are. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't go there to see if I still loved him. I went to find out if I was still his. If part of me was still stuck waiting at that door for him to come back. John crossed the room slowly, sat beside her, but didn't touch her yet. And she turned to him, eyes steady. I'm not. I was waiting for closure. But what I really needed was to see who he was now, and who I am without him. John searched her face, and when he didn't speak, she added, I love you, John, and not just because you stayed, not because you were the safe choice. I love you because when I broke, you didn't try to fix me. You just sat with me in the dark until I found my own light. His throat bobbed slightly. You sure? About this? Julia reached out and took his hand. I'm sure. Scott will always be a scar, but I healed around it. And you're not a replacement for him. You're the first real thing I've had since everything fell apart. He looked at her for a long moment, then pulled her in, gently, as if he didn't want to break this quiet truth between them. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt her heart unclench. They didn't say anything else for a while. They just sat there in the fading light, fingers intertwined. Not everything was perfect. There would still be questions, shadows, and pieces of the past that lingered. But there was something else too. Peace. Later that night, Julia lay beside John in bed, watching him breathe. She thought of all the years she gave to Scott, all the versions of herself she'd molded to fit into that old life, and she didn't regret the love. Not completely. But she finally understood something. Healing wasn't forgetting, it was choosing not to bleed from the same wound again. She glanced at her phone one last time. No new messages from Scott. She was glad. Some doors needed to stay closed. The next few days were quieter. Not silent, but calm. Like the aftermath of a storm that finally passed. Julia found herself breathing differently, deeper, more present. She hadn't realized how much of her life had been lived in emotional limbo until it wasn't anymore. John didn't press her with questions. He didn't ask for constant reassurance, didn't hover. He just was, the way he always had been, steady, patient. And Julia responded to that with something she hadn't given anyone in a long time, trust. They went out for dinner 2 nights later. Something simple, an old diner they liked, the kind where the waitresses knew their order before they sat down. Nothing extravagant, but halfway through her fries, Julia reached across the table and said, You know I'm not going anywhere, right? John smiled softly. Yeah. I do now. The conversation drifted to work, to Wanda's newest chaos project. Something about wanting to turn Julia's studio into a weekend workshop space. Julia laughed as she recounted Wanda's wild pitch and how she'd agreed without realizing she'd committed to a monthly art class for teenagers. John chuckled. You're really doing it, huh? Living the life you always talked about, Julia nodded. Yeah. Turns out I'm better without someone dragging me down. He reached for her hand again and gave it a squeeze. But even as she laughed and talked with John, something unsettled lingered in the back of her mind. Not about Scott. She'd closed that door, locked it. It was about her, who she used to be, who she had become, and the messy bridge in between. There were things she still hadn't faced, not because she couldn't, but because she had never given herself permission to ask, why did I stay with someone who made me feel small for so long? The next morning, Julia drove out to her old neighborhood, the place she and Scott had lived. The building hadn't changed. The same cracked paint on the bricks, the same crooked mailbox. She parked across the street and just watched for a while, memories drifting in like ghosts. That apartment had seen every version of her, in love, in fear, in denial, in heartbreak. It was where she first learned how loneliness could exist. Even in a shared bed, she closed her eyes and whispered something, not meant for anyone else. I forgive you. But I'm not carrying you with me anymore. She didn't know if it was for Scott or for herself, maybe both, but it felt real. It felt final. Back at her studio, Julia found Wanda rearranging canvases and half yelling at her phone. Oh good, you're back, Wanda said, not even looking up. You're teaching a class Saturday, and I need you to pretend you're excited. Julia smiled. I am excited. Weirdly, Wanda paused, eyed her. You okay? Yeah, Julia said. I'm free. Wanda didn't press, just gave her a knowing look and tossed her a paintbrush. Good. Then get your ass to work. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paint, laughter, and the hum of her life rebuilding itself, one brushstroke at a time. By sunset, Julia stood alone in front of a blank canvas. She didn't know what she was about to paint, but for the first time in years, it didn't need to mean anything for anyone else. It was hers, all of it. That night, Julia painted until the muscles in her arm ached, and the sky outside her studio turned from blue to black. The canvas in front of her wasn't anything specific. No perfect image, no clear meaning, just emotion, raw and layered. Streaks of color tangled with movement and stillness. The kind of thing that couldn't be explained in words. It felt like breathing, without lungs full of smoke. When she finally stepped back, her shirt speckled in paint, her hands sore and stained, she realized something. She hadn't thought about Scott once while she painted. Not once. That used to be impossible. Even when he was gone, he was everywhere, in the shadows of her art, in the bitterness of her brush. But now, he wasn't in this at all. The next morning, Julia woke up beside John and felt warmth before anything else. Not fire, not adrenaline, just a steady, anchored warmth. His breathing was slow, his face calm. She watched him for a few seconds, wondering how he'd ended up becoming her home, when all she ever thought she wanted was someone to rescue her. But John never rescued her. He waited. That was the difference. Scott had always wanted to be the hero. John had just wanted her to win. Later that day, as she prepped the studio for the first teen art class Wanda had dragged her into, she felt nerves twist in her stomach. Not fear, just that old tug of doubt. But when the kids started pouring in, loud and awkward and curious, the nerves dissolved. They asked questions. They teased each other. One of the boys refused to pick up a paintbrush until she handed him one and said, "There are no wrong answers on this canvas." He shrugged and painted a black square. She smiled and told him it was perfect. After the class, she found herself sitting in the back of the studio, sipping iced tea with Wanda, both of them exhausted. Wanda nudged her. "So, you're good, huh?" Julia laughed. "I'm Something better than good. I'm whole. Wanda raised an eyebrow. Big word. Sounds heavy. It is, Julia said. But it fits. Then Wanda added, You know, I hated Scott. Always did. Julia tilted her head. You never said anything. Because you loved him, Wanda replied, shrugging. Didn't want to be that friend. You could have told me. You wouldn't have listened. Julia laughed, because it was true. Back then, she would have defended Scott to the grave, even when he left her bleeding emotionally on the kitchen floor. But now, hearing it, it didn't sting. It felt like looking at an old scar and remembering the pain, but no longer feeling it. That evening back home, Julia and John sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed over the sky. She reached for his hand, and after a long moment of silence, she said, I saw the place, the old apartment. John turned to look at her. How'd it feel? Like standing over a grave, she said. Like visiting a version of myself that doesn't live anymore. He didn't speak, just squeezed her hand tighter. I think, she continued slowly, I spent a lot of time thinking. Healing meant forgetting. But now I get it. It means remembering without falling apart. John looked at her then, eyes soft and warm. You didn't just heal, Julia. You grew. You became someone stronger. She smiled. Someone smarter. Someone who knows what she wants. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. Yeah, I do. There were no fireworks, no dramatic declarations. Just two people, sitting quietly, in a life they were building every day with trust and choice. And for the first time in a long, chaotic, painful chapter of her life, Julia had nothing left to prove to anyone, not even herself. Weeks passed, then months. Julia's life began to take a new rhythm. Less about surviving, more about being. The studio blossomed into a space that felt alive. Her classes filled up, her paintings sold again, and the laughter that used to feel forced now came easily, without guilt or hesitation. One afternoon, she came across the letter Scott had written. It had slipped behind a drawer in her desk. Its edges curled slightly. The ink smudged just a bit near the bottom. She held it for a moment, read it again, not because she missed him, but because she wanted to see how it made her feel now. It didn't sting anymore. She folded it neatly, walked outside, and without a dramatic pause or emotional breakdown, dropped it into the trash bin. No fire, no ceremony, just gone. It felt clean. John never asked about Scott again. He didn't need to. Their relationship wasn't built on testing loyalty or poking at old wounds. It was quiet, intentional, and rooted in mutual respect. They still had their fights, like any couple, about dishes, about plans, about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. But there was never the fear of silence stretching too long. Never the panic that someone might walk out in the middle of the night and never come back. That kind of safety was new and sacred. Julia had dinner with Wanda one Friday night at their favorite Thai place. Over too many dumplings, Wanda raised her glass and said, "To the girl who finally stopped chasing ghosts." Julia laughed. "To the girl who started painting for herself again." Wanda nodded. "And to the man who didn't need to save you, just held the door while you saved yourself." They clinked glasses. That night, Julia walked home alone, not because she needed space, but because she wanted the quiet. The streets were peaceful. The air was cool. As she walked, she passed by the small flower shop where Scott used to buy her roses. Always when he'd done something wrong, she smiled but didn't stop. There was nothing left to go back to. When she got home, John was waiting for her in the kitchen, barefoot, hair damp from a shower. He looked up from his phone. gave her a crooked grin. "You look like you walked through your past and left the door swinging behind you." She walked straight into his arms. "I did." He kissed her forehead. "Good. Let it stay shut." Later that night, Julia lay awake beside him, her hand resting over his heart. The world was quiet except for the crickets outside and the sound of their breathing. She thought about how easy it would have been to fall back into old patterns, to confuse passion for love, chaos for depth. But this was real. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was earned, and for the first time in a long time, Julia didn't feel like a woman recovering from heartbreak. She felt like someone who had chosen peace, and the most beautiful part, she had chosen it for herself. Not because anyone asked her to, not for revenge, not for redemption, just because she finally realized she was worth it. As she drifted off to sleep, tucked into the warmth of someone who never made her question her worth, a quiet truth settled deep in her chest. He broke her. He left her. But she healed. And in that healing, she found something better than closure.